What's that tone all about? It's my money that I've earned, so what's the harm in using it as I see fit? It's not like I'm letting you go hungry. Even when asked, he doesn't answer where the money went. The money that should have been for our family's living expenses, my husband's salary, just disappeared. Furthermore, my husband had also been misusing even larger sums of money. When I confronted him, from that day on, he shut himself in a small room and completely stopped talking. I wondered alone if this was the end for us, day after day. But then, a turning point arrived. When my husband woke up, he was surrounded by me, our children, and both my parents and his parents. We're not letting you escape this time. It was the start of an all-out family intervention. What's this text? Who made you write this? What I finally got out of him was the name of a charming store. It was a place like a cafe, where young girls in uniforms served customers. My husband was sniffling and crying. Of course, there was no mercy. First, gather information and then pass judgment. Let's teach him that foolish behavior deserves appropriate punishment. My name is Mary Thompson. I'm in my late 40s, having been married for nearly 20 years. Our children are Ralph, a college student, and Melissa, a high school student. My husband, Stanley, holds a managerial position at a typical company. Having settled down with child-rearing, I too returned to work. In my younger days, I had worked full-time at a design company, and now they've rehired me for part-time work. Chatting with colleagues at work is fun, and it's reassuring to see our two children growing up. My husband is quiet but sincere, and we had very peaceful and enjoyable days. I never imagined that such an incident could occur. The change started when my husband began to thoroughly avoid me, eating separately, sleeping in different rooms, and even keeping his laundry separate. In fact, I realize now there were signs even earlier. Perhaps I didn't want to face them because I still wanted to believe in my husband somewhere deep down. Now is the time to stop turning away and start from the first sign I remember. The first time I felt something was off was when my husband started coming home unusually late. He often came home drunk, so I initially thought it was just an increase in social engagements, but 1 month, 2 months, 3 months passed and the late nights only increased. It was too much to chalk up to just being busy with work. That's why I decided to ask him about it. Honey, you've been coming home quite late for a while now. You seem to be out drinking, but what's going on? I asked him while he was unwinding his tie after coming home. Then, my husband paused and, for some reason, his eyes darted around briefly. Clearing his throat, he responded in a slightly irritated tone. Well, I should be able to relax a little, right? I'm just using my allowance. Let me have my breaks, can't I? His curt response irked me a bit, but I had to admit, his point was valid. Considering he was managing within the small allowance, maybe I should commend him instead. Still, I couldn't help but want to say something, so I let out a sigh mixed with a small complaint. I mean, it's fine if you're just having a moderate amount of fun with nothing special, but do take care not to drink too much. We're both not getting any younger. He just grunted. But the odd feeling didn't end there. When I went to withdraw some living expenses, I froze upon seeing my husband's bank account balance. Tens of thousands had been withdrawn multiple times without my knowledge. Hey, honey? Do you know anything about these withdrawals? That night, I confronted my husband with the bank statement as soon as he got home. Since this was something new, I couldn't help suspecting fraud or unauthorized transactions. It crossed my mind that someone might be withdrawing my husband's salary without his consent. However, his reply was terribly irritable. What's that tone? It's my money I've earned, so I can use it however I want. It's not like we're struggling to eat. Indeed, we weren't struggling for food. In fact, my income alone could cover our groceries. That was true, but being scolded didn't sit right with me. After all, I wasn't accusing him, just considering the possibility it might be stolen. No, that's not it. It's fine if you use it. I was just shocked because I thought it might be one of those fraudulent withdrawals I've heard about recently. If you had just told me you were going to use it. I mean, it's your account, but the utility and living expenses come out of it, so you should have told me in advance. Don't you think that would surprise anyone? I couldn't help but sound quite annoyed. My husband grimaced as if annoyed, clicked his tongue quietly, and turned his face away. I was about to say something about his attitude but managed to hold back. So, what did you spend it on? Did you pick up a new hobby? I forced a smile and asked brightly, but got no response. He just walked briskly towards the bathroom. No excuses, no explanation of what the money was used for. Since the withdrawals were from the remaining balance in his account, I couldn't complain any further. But it wasn't that I was telling him not to spend money, I just didn't want him to cause confusion with secretive actions. Yet, the uneasy feeling lingered. Could his late returns be related to how he was spending the money? During the hours he wasn't home, I couldn't help but wonder what he was up to. The next evening, my husband didn't come home for dinner again. When I vented to Ralph and Melissa at the dinner table, the kids seemed unconcerned and said, "Let Dad have his freedom too. Mom, you go out for lunch and stuff, right? It's just a different time for having fun." Ralph continued without stopping his meal, and Melissa added, "Dad works all day, and he can only have fun at night, right? He doesn't come home drunk or anything, so if it's just a normal hobby, why not let it slide?" Hearing them speak like this made me feel like I had no allies, which was frustrating. But upon reflection, my husband had always been a devoted father to our family. Indeed, the kids had a point. While I was still upset, I changed the subject and ended the conversation. As I washed the dishes after dinner, I gradually calmed down. The money my husband withdrew was around $400 to $500 at a time, and it happened once or twice a month. It's not a small amount to spend on hobbies, but maybe it's not too excessive if it's just once a month. I wish he had discussed it with me, but I probably would have objected if he had. I'm the type to speak my mind, unlike my husband, who's more passive and timid. I couldn't naturally accept him spending money on himself like my children did. Even if he had bravely suggested discussing the spending, there's a good chance I would have sharply rejected it. Even though I think so, my husband, after all these years, probably expected that. Maybe that's why he took drastic measures. It's painful to think that maybe I've cornered him to the point where he can't say anything. However, the next day, I quickly discarded any self-blame. I realized that the withdrawals weren't just from his regular salary, but also from our savings account. The account had been drained of $40,000. I was furious. What the heck? You canceled the savings account without asking. That was for Melissa's education. What are we supposed to do now? Melissa was sobbing behind me. It was understandable. Without that money, Melissa would start her college life without a penny to her name. Perhaps I could cover the entrance fees with my savings. But we'd have to cut back significantly on everything, including where she'd live and her appliances. I wanted her to live somewhere decent because she'd be on her own, and now it's all ruined. Even as I raged, my husband just sulked and stayed silent. This is unbelievable. What did you spend $40,000 on? Staying silent won't make this go away. Ralph shouted at him, and only then did my husband show signs of being shaken. He darted his eyes around and bit his lip. He looked like a victim. This is no joke. The savings account was funded by both of us, each contributing $20,000. Maybe it's not legally punishable because we're family, but to me, it feels like he's completely in the realm of theft. I'm getting my $20,000 back, that's for sure. As I said this with restrained anger, my husband glared at me with a shocked expression. That night, he didn't sleep in our bedroom but in a small traditional room we usually use for storage. The next day, he moved his suits and other belongings there, making his preparations in that room. He stopped eating with the family entirely, leaving the house silently and returning without saying a word. His return times became later and later, often not until the morning. At home, he secluded himself in the small room, managing his meals with takeout or fast food. He didn't even do his laundry at home anymore. Perhaps he's using a laundromat. We were essentially separated within the house. There was no progress on the return of the misused money. The word divorce started to flicker in my mind. This went on for 3 weeks until one midnight when I woke up to the sound of my husband coming home. I then listened intently to the sound of water. Probably him preparing something to eat in the kitchen. Initially, I would go out to talk whenever I heard noises. But whenever he saw my face, he would either flee back into his room or leave the house until the next day. I was thinking about ambushing him in the room he was hiding in when it happened. Suddenly, there was a loud bang. After that, more rattling and banging sounds that made me catch my breath. As I held my breath wondering what was going on, it suddenly went quiet. Cautiously, I tiptoed towards the kitchen. What? My husband was lying on the floor, writhing in pain. Seeing his hands on his throat, I realized he might have choked on something. I tapped his shoulder, but there was no response. Turning on the light, I saw his face was turning a terrible shade of red-purple. Nearly panicking, I screamed and called the kids. Ralph, Melissa, wake up! Help! Then, while my husband was barely conscious, I kept hitting his back and called an ambulance. By the time the ambulance arrived, he had become even less responsive. The paramedics hit his back hard, but nothing came out. I was terrified until we reached the hospital. Forgetting about the Cold War and the misused money, I just prayed he would survive. Fortunately, my husband pulled through. It turned out the cause was a piece of bread he swallowed whole. That's fine. Thankfully, his life was not in danger, and they managed to remove the small foreign objects, so that's that. The real problem lay elsewhere. Why, what on earth? It's no wonder the doctor who examined him was shocked. When they opened his dress shirt, there were words all over his body written in what seemed like a permanent marker. The round, cute letters said things like "come back soon" and "love you," along with what looked like signatures. There were some that were fading and some that looked brand new. I wonder why he wrote so much like this. The middle-aged doctor was trembling slightly, probably trying to suppress a laugh. It was so embarrassing. I instinctively covered my face and looked up to the sky. When my husband woke up, he was surrounded by me, our children, and both our in-laws and my parents. My husband, cornered by the questioning of 7 people, could not escape. What's with that writing? Who wrote it? What I finally got out of him was that it was the name of a nightclub. Further investigation revealed it was like a place where young girls in uniforms serve customers. It appears at this place you can take instant photos with the girls, known as Polaroids. And each photo costs over $10, which was quite shocking to hear. I wrote this. I wanted to keep the handwriting of the girl I like on my body. My husband, besieged by the whole family, sobbed and answered tearfully. There's a culture in that club where the girls write messages on the Polaroids, and he had copied his favorite girl's handwriting onto his body. He even had days where he only washed his hair to avoid washing off the writing when taking a shower. The more he confessed, the more shockingly clear everything became. Looking closely, the scribbles were only on his arms, stomach, and chest, with nothing on his back. Taking a bold step, I had him lower his trousers, and found writings on his thighs and calves as well. His right hand, which he writes with, had nothing on it, and all the writings were in places easy for him to reach himself. Indeed, it looked as though he had written it himself. Afterward, my children and I left the care and various procedures regarding my husband to my in-laws and rushed home. We needed to check his belongings. We have to make sure he hasn't squandered more. This is like an affair. Betraying Mom. Unforgivable. Melissa exclaimed in a shrill voice. Even I was taken aback by the angry face of normally gentle Melissa. Ralph had already started rummaging through my husband's bag and coat pockets. When we opened a suitcase he had hidden away, it was filled with a massive amount of Polaroids. Just estimating the cost of each photo, it looked like at least $1,000 had vanished. On some of the Polaroids, there were writings that matched almost exactly the marker on my husband's body. It seemed he really did copy them from the Polaroids himself. It was so baffling that I had to hold my head. Is this considered cheating? Could it be that the girls at the club are just doing their job? He seemed pretty infatuated, but there's no trace of any personal contact. At my words, Ralph crossed his arms and hummed thoughtfully. He seemed to be quickly checking the club's website and then nodded as he searched for something else. Eventually, Ralph stopped manipulating his smartphone. Mom, I checked the reviews on the message board. This club bans personal contact and doesn't allow any romantic-type interactions. It also has the address and the names of the staff members. The address wasn't too far away. And it seemed that Kristen, my husband's favorite, was there today. I decided to take a bold step and visit the club myself. With Ralph accompanying me, we nervously approached the establishment. Welcome. The young ladies greeted us with sugary voices and perfect smiles, all stationed behind the counter. Except when delivering orders, they did not come to the customer's side. Though you can talk over the counter, there's no sitting next to customers for service. It seems like a genuinely wholesome place. From what I heard from the staff and other customers, even the evening bar scene doesn't change much in atmosphere. When it turns into a bar, the only difference is that alcohol is added to the menu. Excuse me, I'm Mary, and I'm Stanley's wife. Is Kristen here? I wanted to talk about Stanley. As soon as I mentioned my husband's name, Kristen's face momentarily tensed. Ralph and I were led to a corner where it was harder for other patrons to overhear us. While sipping overpriced orange juice, I talked with my husband's favorite girl. Yes. He often buys Polaroids and tips well, so he's considered a good customer. My husband was known for spending generously, which the establishment welcomed because it boosted their revenue. However, a new staff member who had transferred from another place recognized him. And she mentioned that he had been banned from another club for being too clingy to the staff members. He had caused trouble there too, damaging property when rejected, and had nearly involved the police before settling the matter by paying for the damages. Could that have been around August? I mentioned the time when Stanley had secretly tapped into Melissa's college fund. Some girls whispered in the back, and Kristen nodded at us, confirming my suspicion. So, he needed money because of that. He had selfishly imposed his desires on someone uninterested, and now he was paying for his self-inflicted troubles by dipping into funds meant for his beloved daughter's future. Unforgivable. Not long after I heard about the other shop's troubles, he asked me for personal contact information. Our shop prohibits that, and it really scared me, so I refused. Since then, the whole shop had been on alert, marking him as a customer to watch. The disappointment and shame came with a rising anger from within me. I wished I could drag my husband here right now and make him apologize to the shop for all the trouble he caused. That's when it happened. Stay away from Kristen! Kristen, I'm here to save you! Suddenly, a loud voice disrupted us, and Stanley rushed to our table. He probably thought of himself as some kind of hero. However, his beloved Kristen screamed and hid behind other staff members. Stanley's eyes were bloodshot with fury, but when he noticed Ralph, he froze in shock. Maybe he hadn't seen Ralph since he was closer to the exit. Meanwhile, Ralph looked on with a gaze devoid of any light, watching his disappointing father's spectacle. Manager! Please help, he's here! Kristen called for help in a sharp whisper to someone behind the counter. Stanley glared at me, but probably the one Kristen really wanted to be saved from was him. As evidence, whenever Stanley tried to approach, Kristen recoiled and fled deeper into the shop. Stanley stood frozen, shocked by Kristen's reaction. I was trying to get a divorce so I could marry you, he muttered in a daze. The audacity of his words nearly made me grab him by the collar. Just then, Ralph stopped me and quickly took out his phone to do something. Stanley staggered after Kristen as she fled behind the counter, still speaking. I tried hard. If I could get divorced, I'd get money, and then I could give you the wedding of your dreams. The next moment, several girls gasped in shock and disgust, with cries of gross, and this makes no sense. Some even began to laugh, and I became distant. I wasn't upset that my husband had fallen for another woman and wanted a divorce. What disappointed me was realizing that I had married a man who mistook professional courtesy for genuine affection and had not noticed it for over 20 years. It was as if he was mistaking customer service's obligatory smile for romantic interest. Moreover, if he had found someone else, he should have just filed for divorce himself, instead of trying to manipulate me. I'm sorry, this must be so hard for you. But for me, it's strictly business. I really don't have any personal interaction with him, and it really bothers me. It was an ice-cold manner of speaking. That revealed her deep disdain for my husband. Seeing Kristen's reaction, Stanley's eyes widened. Then, in the next instant, he grabbed a glass from a nearby patron and smashed it on the floor. Damn it! His tantrum and the way he scratched at his head were completely unlike the quiet man I had known. As I was chilled by his sudden change, several staff members rushed over and pushed him out of the establishment. I hurriedly apologized all around, and ironically, the patron whose glass was taken ended up comforting me. Mom, we caught Dad. Let's just go home, Grandpa and Grandma are waiting. Ralph, who had somehow gotten outside with Stanley, called out to me breathlessly. I quickly paid and followed Ralph to the car. In the car ride home, Ralph and I sat in the back seat on either side of Stanley. We had to do that to prevent him from escaping. There was so much I wanted to say, but out of respect for the driver, I remained silent. Ralph kept his mouth shut tight as well. Only Stanley's sniffling filled the car. The driver's glances through the rearview mirror felt painful. By this point, my mind was completely dominated by thoughts of divorce. Before coming to the club, I still had doubts, but now I was eager to rush to the courthouse. When we arrived home, Melissa and both his and my parents were waiting. We made Stanley sit on the chair. Melissa was the first to speak. I've told everyone about how you used my college savings. And all those creepy scribbles all over you are just too much. She glared at Stanley without trying to hide her tear-stained eyes. All grandparents from both sides absolutely adore their grandchildren, unable to help themselves. Even my in-laws, when weighing their affection between their son and granddaughter, seemed to overwhelmingly favor the granddaughter, casting stern glances at Stanley. Mom, are you going to divorce him? Even if you don't, I want to cut ties with this guy. Melissa asked me. By this guy, she of course meant Stanley. As I nodded wearily, Stanley let out a sound that seemed to ask, what? Could he really still believe he might be forgiven, even now? I do too. Ralph said curtly, turning his face away. He refuses to even look at Stanley. Having been with me at the club to hear everything firsthand, Ralph was probably even more disillusioned with Stanley than Melissa was. Of course, I'm getting a divorce. It's just not possible anymore. Stanley was considered quite a dangerous misinterpretation at the club too. He had been banned from other places, and at one point, he nearly caused a police incident. He used Melissa's college savings for a settlement. Sighs escaped from the parents of both families. My mother-in-law quietly covered her eyes and started to cry. As a mother myself, I understand the feeling. If my own child ended up like this, I'd probably cry my eyes out too. Stanley trembled and looked at Ralph and Melissa repeatedly, his lips quivering. Are you both really going to side with Mary? Mary, are you really saying you want to divorce me? The combined sounds of "huh" from Ralph, Melissa, and me overlapped. Stanley looked around again and paled. He finally realized the icy stares from the three of us. I'm sorry, I won't do it again, I'm sorry. Stanley was sobbing, but no one offered him a kind word. Ralph clicked his tongue. Melissa glared at Stanley with harsh breaths. I calmly started discussing what needed to be done about the divorce with my parents and in-laws. From now on, we'll communicate through a lawyer. The house is in his name, so we'll move out, but it might take some time. I can't stand to be in the same house with him during that time. Stanley, could you stay in a hotel? As I spoke, Stanley continued to cry. Suddenly, he rose and clung to my daughter's legs. Melissa screamed and kicked him away. Gross! He got his snot on me. Disgusting! How can this guy be my parent? Ralph, on the other hand, had a look that could be titled "This is despair," and kept his gaze on the floor. Although my children are strangers to me if we sever ties, it's pitiful they have to share Stanley's blood. I resolved to be stronger than ever for them. We temporarily moved into my parents' house. It was a cozy house perfect for an elderly couple but a bit cramped for us, but it was just until Stanley moved out. 2 days later, we received a call from my in-laws. Stanley moved into his parents' home, so we received a message that the kids and I could stay in our original house until they became independent. I expressed my gratitude to my father-in-law, who spoke with a somber tone, and my children and I returned to our familiar home. About a week after our divorce was finalized, Stanley, unrepentant as ever, showed up again at the club where Kristen worked. Stanley, you're no longer welcome here. If you persist, we'll have to call the police. A staff member flatly told my ex-husband. Rejected at the door, Stanley lost his temper and caused a scene outside the club. He broke a sign and part of the door, resulting in the police being called. This time too, it ended in a settlement, but he had to spend a significant part of his dwindling savings. Due to his past behavior, it seemed he had been blacklisted, as he was now being turned away from other establishments right from the start. It turned out that Kristen, whom Stanley had been obsessed with, actually had a boyfriend and had left the club to get married. The revelation that Kristen was no longer available shocked Stanley deeply, as he hadn't let go of his obsession with her. He even tried to talk to Kristen directly and track down her home, but, unsurprisingly, he was reported to the police again for stalking and was sternly warned. Then, Stanley lost everything. Though he wasn't prosecuted, the news of his actions reached his company, forcing him to resign. Having lost his family, any chance with Kristen, his job, and his finances, Stanley is now full of regret and claims to be deeply reflective, and in the midst of this mess, he is trying to persuade me to get back together with him. I was caught off guard walking home from shopping, and he ambushed me near our house. I was wrong. Please forgive me. He groveled, a mess of tears and snot, trying to cling to me, which made me hurriedly flee. A reunion is out of the question. I might even go to pray for a severance of ties next. I managed to escape and dashed into the house, locking the door. It was a bit frightening since he lingered in front of the house for so long, but fortunately, Ralph was home and promised to protect me. We even had to call my in-laws to come and get him. There's absolutely no chance of getting back together. All communication will go through my lawyer from now on. If this continues, I'll seek a restraining order. Don't ever come to our house again, I declared from behind Ralph, who stood protectively. Stanley was taken away in his parents' car, continuing to sob and scrunch up his face. I couldn't help but wonder how someone I married, thinking he was an ordinary guy, could turn out like this. It's not your fault, Mom. People change, just think of him as a monster that was pretending to be human. Ralph consoled me, not alone in his efforts, as Melissa also offered comfort when she got home. We immediately started planning to move to a new location. It was where Stanley wouldn't know where to find us, aiming for a peaceful life. For now, let's stay in a family rental until Melissa and Ralph move out on their own. I considered it. Melissa would be leaving home soon, and Ralph planned to live alone in the city after graduating from college. We used to live in a home, but maybe it was time to choose a smaller place. The following week, with help from a lawyer, I decided what to demand from Stanley in the divorce. Division of property, repayment of the $20,000 I contributed to our fixed deposit. I also decided to get child support for my children. Half a year later, most of my demands were met as agreed. The $20,000 repayment significantly impacted Stanley, since he had to borrow money from relatives and work multiple jobs, including day labor, to make ends meet. My children and I had moved out and started condo life as a trio. The long ordeal was finally over. On the day we moved, I celebrated the resolution with my children with a modest celebration. Just a meal at a fancy restaurant. It felt extraordinarily delicious, perhaps because of the lightness in our hearts. With Melissa preparing to leave home for college in a few months, any family meal out became a cherished occasion. I truly wished to cherish these precious moments. That night, Ralph approached me and said, "Mom, I'm sorry for saying it was okay to let Dad have his freedom when he first started spending money recklessly. If I hadn't ignored it then, maybe we could have resolved this sooner. You were right, I'm sorry." I had thought he was taking things too lightly, but it seems Ralph had been thinking deeply about it after all. Seeing my child's growth made me so happy that I didn't care that he hadn't supported me before. Prompted by Ralph's behavior, Melissa nudged my arm. "I feel the same as Ralph. Sorry, Mom. I mean, that guy, he still hasn't paid back all the money he used, right? If going to college gets tough, don't hide it, tell me. I'll earn it myself." Melissa's words were reassuring, far from the gentle but timid child I thought she was. They had both truly grown up. Meeting these children was undeniably a treasure. Even with such an ex-husband, I can't help but feel grateful for that. "Don't worry about the money. It's really okay. Ralph and Melissa, you both have become so responsible without me noticing." Tears welled up in my eyes, and both kids hugged me from the sides. I felt strongly that happiness was right here with us. 5 years have passed since that incident. After graduating from college, Ralph surprisingly started a company with peers his age. He also moved out on his own, working hard in a responsible position within his vibrant young company. Melissa went off to college as planned, leaving our hometown. She's busy with part-time jobs but enjoys her daily life at school. I continue with my part-time job, living smoothly. Our new home is a modestly sized apartment. Recently, I've begun going to the gym, enjoying my new solo life to the fullest. I'm committed to staying active to enjoy life healthily. While I'd like to say everything is perfect, there's just one concern. Getting friendly with my gym mates has led to frequent outings for light meals or sweets after working out. I fear I'm eating more than I'm burning off, feeling a bit plumper instead of slimmer. But it's so much fun, I like to believe it's good for both my mind and body. This is the start of a lighter, freer phase of my life.